Hello, how are you all doing? So thrilled to be joining here today. My name is Todd Hossein. I'm the founder and the co-CEO of Second Muse, and I am joined here by my brother and colleague, Mike Green from the National Institute for Inclusive Competitiveness. So the setup today is we're going to have a bit of a conversation. Specifically, we're going to talk about closing the wealth gap and how entrepreneurs and economies in general have we're going to talk a little bit about the nature of the wealth gap and what it's looking like today. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of it, because it's important to know kind of where we came from so that we can go somewhere different in the future. And then we'll talk a little bit specifically about the role of entrepreneurs in this work. So, Mike, I'm wondering if you could start with welcome, of course, and maybe you can start with a little bit of an intro of yourself as well as the National Institute for Inclusive Competitiveness, and then I'll do the same, and we can kick this off.
Okay, I appreciate it, Todd. I'm the chief strategist at the National Institute for Inclusive Competitiveness. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Mike.
I'm getting a bit of an echo, so I'm not sure why. Okay, well, I'll start over. I'm the chief strategist at the National Institute for Inclusive Competitiveness. And this effort began a decade ago when I co-founded a national consultancy with Jonathan Holyfield, a former NFL player. He was the architect of inclusive competitiveness, and he wrote this book, The Future Economy and Inclusive Competitiveness, How Demographic Trends and Innovation Can Create Prosperity for All Americans. I know that's a mouthful. Jonathan went on to become the executive director of the White House Initiative on HBCU and a principal influencer in codifying IC strategies into law, which Congress passed this year. Now, when Jonathan elevated to working on policy changes, I joined forces with Dr. Jamie Bracy Green, who, in no relation, who operationalized IC strategies at the ground level through the launch of a Center for Inclusive Competitiveness at Temple University. Now, the success of that CIC led to the launch of the National Institute for Inclusive Competitiveness with the support of Shell Oil. And our mission is to increase the economic productivity of the most vulnerable populations, MVP, by at least 1% GDP in one generation. That's it. That's me.
Thanks so much, Mike. Appreciate a little bit of the context. Just real quick, we're really proud to be a sponsor of the conference this year. Second Muse has been for the last 15 or so years actively supporting entrepreneurs and the ecosystems that surround them, specifically with an eye towards helping to build economies that create social and environmental justice. We tend to sort of think that economies need to come at the cost of human dignity or at the health of the planet. But unfortunately, this is a design flaw that we've unfortunately enshrined at the altar of economic thinking. And so the truth, as we'll hear from Mike in a bit, is that actually economies work just smarter when they're more inclusive. When people aren't edged out of the economy, you just get more creativity, you get more innovation, and so there's an opportunity for a much brighter future than we've seen in the past. So we'll start kicking off. So one of the things as we're thinking about, ultimately, Mike, the conversation that we're having here is about recognizing that there's been a wealth gap, specifically in the past. And I know that, we work in a little over 100 countries, and we see structures of power and privilege everywhere, anywhere that you go. And would love if maybe you could give a little bit of context about both the history and the present of structures of power and privilege in the United States, specifically as it looks within the context of economic lines, and so that we can understand where we come from, so that we can go somewhere different.
That sounds like a plan. So, if you don't mind, I'm going to take about 3 minutes and set the stage. Is that okay?
Take as long as you want.
So when we think about closing the racial wealth gap in the United States, we should consider starting with an assessment of the status quo. I mean, after all, we have zero ability to change the current economic conditions if we don't have a proper understanding of those conditions, which Dr. King in 1963 described as a shameful condition. Now, here are a few general markers of the current condition of Black America. Let's start with our children. The vast majority of Black children in schools today remain largely segregated from white children. The public schools serving poor Black communities are ubiquitously the worst quality schools in the world's richest nation. Now, this is not a new condition. It was designed that way from the beginning. That condition has remained consistent since Black people became Black Americans in 1868 with the 14th Amendment. So now let's look at the adult condition. Today, Black Americans are at the bottom of the economic ladder, precisely where Dr. King lamented we were in 1963 when he wrote the book Why We Can't Wait and made that comment in chapter 1, which is titled The Negro Revolution, Why 1963. That book should be required reading for anyone interested in the most important movement in the U.S. history, which was proclaimed the most important movement in U.S. history by the Department of Labor in 1965. Yet none of this is taught in any schools today. So those conditions led to the rise of a nonviolent direct action protest in nearly 1,000 cities in 1963. And they're the same conditions we inherited as a society and continue to sustain today. Home ownership among Black Americans is the lowest of all the large demographic groups. It is today where it was in King's day. Black business ownership today, more than 2.6 million, up from more than 200,000 in King's day. Yet, despite the exponential growth in activity, the productivity output is still less than 1% GDP, which is where it was when we walked off the last plantations in Galveston, Texas in 1865. Restricted access to capital then and now remains a consistent problem. In the last 10 years, banks have been fined $243 billion for ongoing discriminatory practices for which they are caught. In 1963, the three demands of the Negro Revolution, get this, were end segregation in schools. We haven't done that. End discrimination in housing. We haven't done that. And end discrimination in banking. We haven't done that either. Those shameful conditions remain the status quo today. And yet no schools, no media, no economic or political campaigns ever speak of this chronic condition. Today, the numbers of Black employers are roughly 2% of the total employer landscape, which is 80% white. These are national census numbers. But when we take a deeper look at the regional and local levels, we find little to no data because the Regional Comprehensive Economic Development Strategies plans, or CEDS plans, as they are called, that blanket the nation, do not prioritize the development of Black-owned enterprises and the growth of Black productivity. Therefore, the data needed to establish current conditions at the local and regional levels and develop economic strategies to change those conditions to make progress toward measurable outcomes doesn't exist. So how can we change any type of condition and we haven't assessed it? We cannot change what we don't know, nor can we teach what we don't know. Now, I'm not saying it's anyone's fault per se. We all inherited a segregationist society that none of us were adequately taught how to assess. And without vision and knowledge, there is no ability for people to make change no matter how loud we protest against a persistent economic tragedy and trauma that envelops our communities and undermines the success of our children. We must understand how these economic systems work. And we must produce strategies that invest in development of critical infrastructure that prioritize the economic empowerment of Black people. Sadly, there has been only one 7-year period of time in the entire history of the United States that the economic empowerment of Black people was prioritized by policymakers. And today, there are no policymakers, no educators, or economic planners with a working knowledge of that era. That's a tragedy. We have literally been forgotten. So, Todd, to quote Dr. King's, the title of Dr. King's last book, where do we go from here?
Yeah, thank you so much for that context, Mike. I'm sure that all of us who are listening to you are are moved by the reality that we see so often in our daily lives reflected in the national numbers as well. I used to be in another life. I used to be a doctor, and when you see one part of the body who is healthy at the expense of another part of the body, we refer to that as a disease. Because we know that when one part of the body is hurting, the whole is hurting actually, and there's no other way to really look at it. The work that we supported about 1,000 innovators last year, and one of the things that we oftentimes think about is how do you influence economic systems? Because it's really tough, right? Like, how do you influence a really big economic system? I can influence somebody who I know and have a relationship with, but I'm just an individual, and how do I influence a broad system? And one of the ways that we think about it is that there's influenceable moments that we look in sort of in broad systems, and those tend to be when those systems are a little bit younger. Like when an economy is forming or an industry is forming. And so one of the reasons that we hang out and support so many entrepreneurs and the ecosystems that surround them is precisely because of the influence that these entrepreneurs, and the communities around them can actually have on the trajectory of the future of an industry. I mean, we've seen situations where this doesn't take a generation, where we've gone from highly privileged industries like advanced manufacturing that you see really low single digits of participation of women or people of color, move to actually the majority participation over the course of, in economic terms, a blink of an eye, 5 years, 6 years. And what we feel that is essential to do this is actually to build a sense of a community around these entrepreneurs, and that when you have entrepreneurs who provide this incredible forward-moving energy and force to a society, and knowing that structures of power and privilege form different ways around different societies, but in a capitalistic society, those structures are primarily in our economy. I'm not sure if you'd probably agree with that, but our economies, bolster and undergird these structures. Therefore, we find that entrepreneurs and the ecosystems that surround them can actually be the force to change the underlying dynamics, to change the culture and the composition of these economies in which they operate, particularly when they're early. So that presents incredible importance to the development of entrepreneurial ecosystems, meaning the investors, the people that are helping the workforce development, the cities, that are working. But let me turn the question sort of back in you. I mean, this is your world as well. Like, what do you feel is the missing ingredient to kind of move us from here to a future that looks very different than the past?
Well, I think that you're pointing in the right direction. Local and regional economic ecosystems need vision, and without a plan, as you know, the old adage, if we fail to plan, we plan to fail. We should remember that people without vision perish. And at the National Institute for Inclusive Competitiveness, our vision is the economic empowerment of the most vulnerable populations as a priority at the local and regional levels. The HBCUs, the historically Black colleges and universities, are a legacy landscape of institutions with a successful track record of cultivating the inherent talent among the nation's most vulnerable populations for more than 150 years. And yet, they've been underfunded, underutilized, and undervalued. We're working with these institutions to increase their capacity and productivity, which will increase the capacity and productivity of the region overall. Now, we have a measurable goal, and we have a measurable time frame, and we have a priority on who benefits. This is the lens that we bring to local and regional economic ecosystems, and we assess their current conditions, from STEM equity in STEM education, or STEAM education, science, technology, engineering, arts, and math, to ownership of lands, homes, and businesses. We evaluate their current economic strategies, and we ask who benefits, who is prioritized, who do you measure, or how do you measure success of your economic strategies and plans? And the paradigm shift that we need, Todd, at regional and local levels is the understanding of equity as a pathway, not just a thing, but a pathway that starts with equitable access to resources and progress toward equitable ownership as the measurable destination. Now, this is not a new concept. It just simply hasn't been applied to Black and brown peoples. When Europeans first arrived on this continent, where tens of millions of non-white peoples from across 600 nations on a single continent had a basic economic philosophy of shared lands and resources for millennia, the Europeans introduced a class of cultures with the idea of individual ownership for personal wealth. Now, this ideology required a violent overthrow of the original owners of the lands, which meant constant wars over a period of nearly 300 years. And we know the outcome. But every generation of white Americans have struggled with including Black and brown people in the ownership equation. And this is really not complicated. Today, policymakers and investors together across the landscape understand that equity is equitable ownership of businesses, lands, and resources. But when white America is asked to apply equity as a concept to race, it somehow morphs away from equitable ownership into confusion that suddenly triggers all kinds of resistance and anxiety. And I find that quite telling. So the bottom line is this: racial demographic shifts in the United States means that in the next generation, a majority of this nation will be minority groups. Regional and global economic competitiveness cannot be sustained with a majority of the population producing so little. So investing in increasing the economic productivity among Black Americans who are at the bottom of the economic ladder is key to empowering all minority groups and improving the economic conditions and quality of life for all Americans. So the tough question for all of us is this: are we ready and willing to embrace a paradigm shift that prioritizes the economic empowerment of Black Americans and produces local and regional economic strategies that guide both investment and policy toward that goal? If the answer is no, then we don't have to do anything but maintain the status quo. But if the answer is yes, then we now have a starting point and lots of work to do over the next 20 years. And as you said, we can achieve it within that period of time. But it starts with having a vision, developing a strategy, producing a plan, investing in the implementation of that plan, monitoring and measuring the effectiveness of that plan, and making adjustments as needed. So, like you said, individual entrepreneurs and business owners do not exist in a vacuum. They operate within economic ecosystems. And without the proper infrastructure supports, a majority will fail consistently. And we know that. That's the reason why Congress invested in establishing the Economic Development Administration in 1965 with a priority purpose of improving the economic conditions of the most distressed communities. But since then, the EDA has invested in economic development districts that have regional development organizations that produce these comprehensive economic development strategies that guide the public-private investments and policymaking, and they have forgotten the people that they were designed to prioritize in the most distressed community. The fact is, none of these plans, none of our SETS plans, you can check the SETS plans in your region, none of them prioritize development of the most distressed communities and populations. So at the end of the day, we have to change our paradigm. We have to develop strategies and plans that foster conditions for equitable prosperity in every region across this country. And that requires investing in an environment conducive to entrepreneurial education, training, support, and success.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I couldn't agree more with just about everything that you were saying. But you and I have had the opportunity to chat about some of these things sort of in the past. I think that there's a number of really interesting things that you bring up. So the first thing that I think that we are sort of talking about is that, you know, this idea and issue of equity, right? Anytime you see a society where a certain part of the human family does not get a fair shake at participating in the economy, it's not just bad for those individuals and the families and those individuals, it's actually a loss for the whole, right? Like, this is not something that sits on a political spectrum. This is not something that sits on, it's almost like, we got big problems that we got to deal with in the world, right? Things like climate change, things like, even if you just look at climate change and the effect that it's going to have on agriculture, boy, it's going to require all kinds of innovations there. If you think about, issues around, cybersecurity, if you're thinking about issues around infrastructure and what we're building and how we're building it. In all of these situations, we're going to need maximal innovation, right? We're going to need maximal sort of brain power, as it were. And if we're not literally reaching from anybody that can, that decreases our likelihood of ultimately addressing some of these, some of the most pressing issues that is facing human civilization, in a sense. And this plays down at the very local level as well, right? We know from, hundreds of years of basic microeconomic thinking that, an economy is substantially stronger when you have more actors that are engaged individually and together. And ultimately that weaves together effectively a more resilient economy. And so this is, when we live in a world where it's becoming more and more difficult to predict the future, right? Because we don't go at this kind of pokey pace where I can tell you that in 40 years, things will be different, but not that much different. Like right now, every decade brings with us a future that a reality that we could not possibly have anticipated. And how do you become resilient? Like, how do you adapt to changes that are unforeseen? Well, gosh, you do that by diversifying. It's what we do with asset classes and finance. It's what we do with innovation. We have excellent evidence that shows that, boards of directors that have more women on it are more financially successful. We know that teams that are more racially diverse actually are more creative and more innovative. So, we know this for a fact that these are better. And so there's the argument is very much there. There's another case that you really brought up, which is that maybe we should, maybe there's an opportunity for us to rethink a little bit on the financial mechanism side, so that we don't look at extractive financial mechanisms and tools, but we actually look a little bit more, from a little bit more from a, from a shared resource standpoint. How can we lift the sea that it rises all boats? Wonder if you have some thoughts about either of those.
Well, it's pretty simple. We can take a lesson from the sports world. You see, in the last 60 years, this nation has built the most powerful and wealthiest nation on earth with a $22 trillion GDP. And we did it mostly with investment in one segment of our human capital. And we know that human capital is our most valuable resource, especially in a globally competitive tech-based innovation economy, innovation being creativity. And now it's fueled by a fourth industrial revolution, which is accelerating the pace of obsolescence. So we need more innovative actors to join Team USA in order to sustain the global competitiveness of the nation, which, by the way, was number one a few years ago. It's now number 10, and it's trending the wrong way. So we have to empower more of our human capital. And knowing that we have neglected and marginalized most of our human capital, which is now the majority of students coming through K-12, we know that in order to train them, to educate them so that they can compete in an innovation economy, so that their ideas and their talent can strengthen Team USA, we're going to have to expose them to STEAM education and entrepreneurship as a core training ground all the way through K-12 and through higher education. We know that, but is there a plan to do that? Is there a strategy to do that? Is there investment set aside for that? Not yet.
Yeah, no, I so appreciate that, Mike. I feel like I could chat with you all day long for hours on end. at the expense of our audience. I do, as you know, I was born in Iran and grew up in Latin America, and so I tend to try to close out anything with a quote from one of the litany of great Persian or Latin American poets. But I think I'll maybe sort of offer a final thought in the words of the late and the great Solomon Burke. If one of us is chained, none of us are free. If people want to reach out to you or want to learn a little bit more about the National Institutes for Inclusive Competitiveness, where should they reach out, Mike?
So all they have to do is go to nicusa.org, NIICUSA.org. And I also am co-founder of Common Ground Conversations on Race in America at commongroundconversations.com.
Thanks so much, Mike. Really appreciate you. Appreciate the work that you're doing. You all do incredible work that is badly needed. Anybody out there that's listening, I encourage you to reach out to Mike. You can find me on secondnews.com. And I think that we'll hand it over to Angela. Thanks so much, all.